Fox 5 and Hot 97 present Street Soldiers with Lisa Evers.
I'm so glad you're joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers on Hip Hop and the Law. Brooklyn rapper Bobby Shmurda came home from doing nearly 7 years behind bars after pleading guilty to weapons and conspiracy charges. He's not the only rapper who landed on the wrong side of the law, and that's raising the question about whether hip-hop artists are being targeted or just unable to leave the streets behind.
Running through these checks till I pass out.
In 2014, Bobby Shmurda was just 19 years old with one of the hottest hit songs in the country when he was charged with weapons and conspiracy charges along with 19 other alleged members of GS9. Cops called it a violent street gang, but it was also known as a music collective. Their arrest, along with a seizure of 21 guns, was announced by then NYPD Commissioner William Bratton. Criminal defense attorney Stacey Richmond represents Lil Wayne and other big-name artists.
I think that we had a youth that came from his associations in the street, and as a result of those associations and his rise to fame, he attracted the attention of the authorities.
High-profile cases involving famous hip-hop artists and other celebrities put public pressure on law enforcement to take action, says former NYPD Lieutenant Darren Porcher.
When you have a media frenzy case that involves any celebrity, be it Alec Baldwin, a hip-hop artist, or an athlete, that's when you have law enforcement coalesce behind whatever strategy is necessary to either bring that person into custody or investigate it, because there's a public outcry.
Bobby Shmurda ended up pleading guilty and was released 10 months early due to good behavior. Now fans are hoping he spends his time in the studio making more hit songs instead of on the streets, where trouble is on every corner. Torre is host of Hip Hop Nation on Sirius XM, as well as an artist and songwriter.
Sky's the limit. You know, he came out the gate with a #1, which is, you know, you've had artists with careers that span multiple decades that never got that. You know, he's also coming home again to a lot of well wishes and a lot of people and a lot of opportunities. I'm just hoping that he has the right people in his corner.
The period where an artist is transitioning from running the streets to running a hit song up the charts can be the most dangerous. Let's find out what our panel has to say. Joining me is criminal defense attorney Stacey Richmond. She's a former president of the New York City Criminal Bar Association, and she's also represented various hip-hop artists, including Lil Wayne. Stacey, great to have you with us.
Great to be here with everyone. Hi.
Thank you so much. Also joining us is Torre. You hear him on Sirius XM, Hip Hop Nation. He's the host. He's also an artist and songwriter. Torre, great to have you with us.
Lisa, thank you for having me back.
Thank you so much. Also joining us is Dr. Darren Porcher. He's a former NYPD lieutenant, criminal justice professor, and law enforcement expert. Darren, great to have you with us.
As always, a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Thank you so much. Stacey, I want to start with you because this is all about the law. When you saw the case of Bobby Shmurda, was there anything about it that stuck out to you? Because a lot of people were saying, wait a minute, he was charged with things that were much more serious than what he should have been charged with. But what was your reaction to the case and also him coming out after nearly 7 years?
Well, that's a loaded set of questions. Firstly, when you see a case where there are conspiracy charges, remember that conspiracy is in the eye of the beholder, and the beholder here is law enforcement. And the problem in hip hop and what's going on in the street is that it creates an assumption. So in terms of what he was charged with, yes, there was a slew of charges. There was an extensive investigation, and then the concept of how one can link so easily into a conspiracy is something that we all must be aware of. I mean, you've treated it before in a number of your Street Soldier segments. That's a critical concern. People need to be in control of their message and what's going out and what can be used and what can be not used against them with regard to these matters.
And then, Torre, in terms of the hip-hop reaction to the Bobby Shmurda case, give us a sense of, you know, how people are feeling about it.
I mean, everybody is excited to have Bobby back, you know, like we spoke about before. Just the manner in which he did his time, you know, as the street would say, was honorable. He stood tall. You know, he didn't snitch. He didn't go out like a sucker. He made sure that him and his team was straight. Rowdy didn't get more time, so Bobby could come home early. And so for that, you know, he's revered. And I think he came home to really, really warm welcomes and open arms. And it looks like he's working already. So that's a plus.
And so that's a good thing. Dr. Darren Porcher, in terms of, people say the cops have it out for hip-hop artists, that they're just looking to nail them. What do you say to that?
I think that could be subjective. I mean, based on the positions that we put ourselves in, it makes us as more viable targets from police. That being said, people such as Bobby Shmurda need to understand that they're public figures. So everything that you do is observed by others. So you need to be cognizant of the fact that other people are watching your behavior. So in many instances, people may want to separate themselves from nefarious conduct because what you say on a record is not necessarily who you are. And from the perspective of law enforcement, I think law enforcement, it's necessary for them to have probable cause if they're going to arrest someone. So this is a case where he was already convicted. Moving forward, I think that his conduct or how he presents himself to the public is something that's going to be highly judged. So as a result, he needs to act accordingly as being a public figure.
Stacey, what about that in terms of the lyrics, in terms of the content? A lot of hip hop is about what happens on the streets, which inevitably is drugs, it's guns, it's violence, it's that type of thing in one segment of hip hop. What role does that play in how law enforcement looks at artists?
Well, again, as Darren was saying and as Therese pointed out, these are high-profile people, so it is a question of interpretation. They can't make an arrest without probable cause, but the interpretation of what that probable cause is, if you're lending yourself to it. So Bobby is not a foolish man. He was, I mean, his statements since he's been released and his inspiration by his fans, he recognizes that he has a target on his back because he's already out, he's done time, he's on post-release supervision, so he will have to still be attendant to the strictures of the court. So yeah, he's gonna want to stay clean of any nefarious behavior, but speaking about this, the poetry of what he speaks is what's going on in the street. It's still a message.
We have much more coming up. Stay with us. Stacey, in terms of the difficulty of representing an artist, you have all the social media. Is the law enforcement, do they understand the difference between art and life, or does all of that go out the window?
I have to say I've been in cases where they have taken my client's social media and they have used it against them. People have put themselves at the mercy of the police by the use of social media. Some of my clients have gone on their social media brandishing weapons, brandishing various actions, drugs, money, and yeah, it has been used in these cases. And that's a problem. People need to be in control of themselves and not hand it over for use against them. It's a double-edged sword because media supports the industry, supports the rise of the fame, but
Right.
it also presents a danger.
Torre, what about that? The image of the artist, because you know you got the stacks of cash, the stacks of cash. There's the weapons, all of that type of thing, the language. What about that? Is that where do you draw the line between okay, these are the lyrics and this is potentially a problem?
I mean, I think if anyone is doing criminal activity, then the last thing you want to do is go and brag about it on social media. And we've seen a lot of people jam themselves up, you know, give the law enforcement all the information, their whereabouts, have their location on. It's ridiculous. But at the same time, as artists, are you not allowed to embellish stories, your lifestyle? You know, if you see a gun in my background and you raid my house, it could be a prop. I mean, I'm a recording artist, right? So there are things that it's a really fine line between art and life and reality, you know, and a lot of times
What Tori is saying is right on point. I mean, I had a case with one of the rappers I was representing mid-case, a gun case, and then he did a video with machine guns and they wanted to increase the charges and we had to blow up the video and demonstrate they were indeed props. Right on point.
All right,
Yeah,
so that happens. Darren, in terms of the social media, when I was reporting on the Chinks murder investigation and interviewing the detectives who cracked the case at police headquarters, I also learned about this. They have a unit that just monitors social media of dozens and dozens and dozens of detectives, and all they do is monitor social media. How much of is that basically people handing over information, you know, an investigation on a silver platter to the cops?
To a point. Technological innovations, more specific to social media, have been a germane component in law enforcement. That being said, what you produce or what you introduce in social media can provide reasonable suspicion for officers to conduct an investigation. So a case in point, as Torre mentioned, if there was a prop of a firearm in a video, there's nothing wrong with officers investigating that, but we have to go back to a common sense approach. You understand what you're doing and how you're doing it. Everything that you do in social media is being amplified times 100,000. That being said, you need to be more cognizant to the fact of what you put out there, but also understand it's a slippery slope because, as Stacey mentioned, the more views you get, the greater your popularity. But you also have to understand from a law enforcement perspective, it puts you in a different position.
Stacey, let's talk about the Bobby Shmurda case because there was, I think a lot of people knew it. Teray, correct me if I'm wrong about this. He was 19, and then overnight, this song "Hot," Boy, the clean version of it, blew up. He became kind of an overnight. He became an overnight sensation, and people were like, "Okay, yeah, we know he was running the streets. He was not, didn't deny that. People knew that was going on, but then all of a sudden we see this." This indictment, more than 60 counts, 19 co-defendants. They go into the recording studio and come away with haul away a whole bunch of guns. Even the police commissioner then, William Bratton, was talking about Bobby Shmurda, which I've never seen him do about any artist or even any individual accused person. And then we find out these conspiracy charges and all of this. Was that overkill?
Well, it really depends on the extent of the investigation. Was it overkill? Look, you only need a few charges to give somebody a significant amount of time. Another thing we need to talk about is the fact of his youth. And young people will make foolish choices. And do we go as hard on that? And back to Darren and Toray's point, the more famous you are, there's a saying, it's the fowl that get eaten. So he's looking large. They can assign him to a group of bloods, a set of bloods, and therefore they expanded that investigation. Was there some aspects of conspiracy? Were there guns recovered? Yeah, these are all problems. But in approaching a youth, did we need to put a 19-year-old away for 7 years? I mean, his mother was very valiant for him, but it's one of the things we have to consider as we look forward in law enforcement. We have to be balanced, and we have to look at the individual within the context of the allegations.
Right, and I think you mean the Crip set. Toray, in terms of how fast the fame came for him, and then the fame, and then all of these charges, and then he's tied into these other cases that were very serious cases, the murder cases, with other alleged, co-conspirators and other alleged members of GS9, which the government said was, a Crip set. What about how sudden this change was for somebody at the age of 19 who's, 1 minute he's hustling on the streets of Brooklyn, next minute he's got like the biggest name stars in hip hop trying to do a remix with him?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's a hard transition for anybody, I think, at any age, when all you know is one lifestyle, and then you thrust into the limelight, you thrust into something else. Imagine being a Brooklyn kid performing in Brooklyn at the Barclays in a packed arena, and you just came from your hood. It's a whirlwind, and I like to speak to the fact that he was so young, right? It takes a lot for you to mature in this world. And sometimes the age and the maturity aren't at the same place. And especially when you're dealing with people that are really, really young, it was a lot. I think it was a lot to deal with. And I think that it was dangerous for his career. The fact that Bobby was able to come home and be welcomed by Sylvia Rome, right? The head of Epic Records, his label that he records at. That was beautiful because that label could have threw him away, got rid of him. He might not have had an opportunity to do anything. And then what happens to a kid with a record, with no work experience, that can't get a decent job to take care of themselves? You end up back in the street.
Right, and end up doing the same thing. Darren, I know you got something to say about that.
He was just on Saturday Night Live prior to being taken into custody. And
right.
He's just a young kid. He's just trying to figure it out. So when you look at the social structure of what a 19-year-old in Brooklyn is dealing with, he's really no different than most of the people within this social context. That being said, it was unfortunate he fell within the throes of law enforcement. I don't want to say he's a good or a bad person, but that being said, the greater your popularity, the more it introduces you to do different things. So when we speak to the social media perspective or his connection with gang sets and things to that effect, it's somewhat the natural order of someone that comes from that environment. And that's what we saw reflective of the incarceration of Bobby Shmurda as a result.
Toray, in terms of the messaging of hip hop, the violence, we've gone through different periods. We've seen Pop Smoke being murdered. We saw Nipsey Hussle being murdered. There are some people who are concerned that there's a resurgence now of gun violence in hip hop in and around the artists. What's your take on that?
There's a lot more money being made than we've ever seen which comes with a lot more risk. I think Jim Jones said, you know, being a rapper is like the hardest or the most dangerous job in the world. And it's true to a degree. You have a lot of people that are, you have a target on your back, right? You got people that you came up with that are looking for a handout. You got police looking at you. You got the ops looking at you. It's so many different facets to it, and people get caught up. Yeah, there are a lot of people who deal with gun violence. There are a lot of people who deal with the activities of the street, but sometimes it's just out of need for protection. It's out of necessity.
Stacey, what about that? And what is your take on that in terms of the whole gun issue? Because you represent Lil Wayne when he caught the gun charge, and guns are looked at very differently in Georgia or Atlanta, where he was living at the time.
One thing is that this is not one country when it comes to gun possession and the perception of the right to bear arms. In New York City, there's a minimum of 3.5 years for simple gun possession. That could be negotiated down to 2 or 1 in various situations. That was very successful for Wayne, but that was a legal gun purchased by his manager legally in a state, but it was not legal in this state and in this city. And it is even from New York City to the rest of the state, it's different. So don't bring a gun to New York City. And that's one thing that people need to be aware of. The fact that there are guns in our state, the whole concept when Bloomberg had this law increased was to create deterrence. Clearly it hasn't worked. And now we're just putting kids in because kids are getting guns because they think it's cool. It's not cool. Maybe we need a panel of people that have, like Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, people that have been killed by gun violence, and kids have to sit with them as part of their school.
Touré, have you felt or sensed any kind of change in the hip hop community among the artists? Because you talk to and interview a lot of artists as well as being an artist yourself, and just the people in the culture. Has there been a change about how they look at guns?
I think that you look at, you know, I think, again, some of this stuff comes with maturity. Some of this stuff just comes with having the right people around you. But you look at a guy like Pop Smoke, who was murdered. You look at a Nipsey Hussle, who was murdered. It makes people want to protect themselves even more. You know, it makes people want to grip up, bear arms even more because, again, a guy like Nipsey, who was in the community trying to do all the right things for all the right reasons. I feel like that should have never, ever, ever happened. You know, right. Like, so, you know, the same with Pop, you know, trying to better his life outside of the hood environment, if you will. Those things should have never happened. So again, people are fearful for their life. You know, you listen, they know exactly where you're going to be. You got to post your show so people can show up. That means they know when your home is empty. That means they know what venue you're going to be at. That when you walk off the stage, they know around the time you leaving. There's so many different variables to being an artist that people don't think about and have to deal with. And you can't always have security. You don't always have security, and security can't always protect you. Sometimes, listen, if your security is handling one guy, you might have to handle the other. It's just difficult. It's just difficult to be an artist.
No, and Darren, what about that? What about that? Because you worked as a bodyguard too for a time. In terms of the exposure of the artists, like what Touré is saying is, you know, they come off the stage, they've got all the jewelry on, they've got, you know, there's people coming around to try to see them. It can be very, very chaotic. What about the vulnerability of artists right now?
Well, I think for an artist, they're dealing with a very challenging environment. From one perspective, they want to be perceived as a real person, not necessarily as a gangster, but someone that's real, that's somewhat on par with the social aspect of what's happening in their communities. They don't want to be seen as a detached entity, so to speak. But the other side of it, you have to understand it. It's okay not to go back to certain communities. You know, like, look, it's fine if you have security, you know where to go and where you shouldn't go. And these people have come from these communities and no one knows it better than them. But then when we look at the communities that we live in, they're somewhat disenfranchised. Socioeconomically impoverished communities that are primarily inhabited by African Americans and Latinos lack certain services that are afforded in other communities. So as a result, we've seen these. Right. We've seen, like Touré mentioned, where are these programs in these communities? And they're non-existent. And that's a problem. So when we look at it through the political spectrum, I think they're at fault as well for not making that necessary application to these communities that are in need. So as a result, the artists that come from these communities feel as if they're on two ends of the fence, and it's very difficult for them to navigate through based on the young age.
I would add to that, like schooling in each of the communities needs direct improvement because the differentials, as Darren was saying and as Touré was saying, are extreme.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers on Hip Hop and the Law. You can watch it again on our Fox 5 NY YouTube page and share it from there with your friends and family. I'm Lisa Evers. Remember, use your mind as your best weapon. Let's push for peace, love, and justice for all.